Greetings. Econ 355, Section 2, History of Economic Thought 1. And we'll get rolling here. Anything going on that we need to announce? There's the events. Hillsdale Half Marathon on Saturday. Other distances ranging from, there's apparently a 200-meter distance even. So if you can only do half of that, well, good. Something's better than nothing. And then at 1 p.m. there's a football scrimmage, and actually the public is invited. I asked the football players, and they would appreciate you going out and cheering for Hillsdale. Hillsdale's probably going to win, given that it's Hillsdale versus Hillsdale. Go Chargers, and things like this. But at any rate, good. Well, I'm going to finish up talking about population. Any questions from last time before I get going? I'm going to finish talking about population, then we're going to talk about David Ricardo and his work. And we'll get into Ricardo, and that'll be probably take us into next week a little bit too. But you know, we've gone through Malthus, and Malthus makes some predictions. We have to talk about why they don't come to pass. And I thought I'd do this just to refresh our memories. What Malthus has told us, what Malthus' argument, and seems to make some sense, is that as population grows, we will end up moving into a long-run equilibrium where most people are at subsistence. And what actually happens is that population indeed grows. And in fact, population grows rather dramatically. Over the course of 100 years, it's going up about 1.5 times. In the next 100 years, oh my gosh, it's about, what's that, about 4 times. And then, wow, next 100 years, it's doubled. But look, 30 million to 60 million, somewhere in that range. This is huge. Okay, but what else is going on? Per capita GDP during the same time is growing. Output is growing even faster than the population because per capita output income is growing fast. It's going up. There's some gain right there from 1700 to 1800, roughly Malthus, lifespan there. He's actually after, working in 1800. But look what happens then. It triples. And then oh my gosh, what's going on? How do we account for this? I want to talk about that before we move on because it's important. And this is underappreciated. People today think of, the kind of lifestyle that we live and think of growth and things like this, and it's like taken for granted. You guys may not realize it. You're among the wealthiest human beings who have ever lived. Most of them, you have unprecedented wealth, everybody here. You are the 1% that Michael Moore complains about. He's a multimillionaire. But you really are at the top. This is unprecedented in human history. For most of history, we were down here, and suddenly something happens. We have to explain these things. And what happens to population? Because it was just kind of cruising along, slow growth, and then it takes off like this, and that takes off. That screams for explanation. Malthus doesn't have it. Malthus has some interesting ideas, but he doesn't have it. So we need to talk about this. And of course, I talked about Paul Ehrlich looks at this and says, oh my gosh, disaster ahead. So let's analyze this at least a little bit. And I think I mentioned last time I kind of ran out of time, but Julian Simon, an economist who began thinking, Paul Ehrlich is right. The world was, the population is a serious problem. I'm going to use my training in statistics and econometrics to demonstrate this. And Julian Simon began working on that. And the more he worked, the more he thought, wait a minute, I am not finding what I expected. In fact, it looks like Ehrlich is just plain wrong. And he becomes one of the most, Ehrlich hated Julian Simon. And to say that is not an exaggeration. He hated him. He's not very nice to his critics or the people that disagree with him. But Simon said, look, if all this stuff that Ehrlich is talking about is true, increasing scarcity, what happens to resource prices? Resource prices must be going up. But I'm doing all this econometric analysis, this statistical analysis, these these series on different resources and what happens to prices, and what do I find? They keep going down. What does that mean? The price goes down, it must be getting less scarce. If they're getting less, resources are getting less scarce. Remember Paul Ehrlich was saying, it's just a fact. Finite world and growing population. End of world must, has to run out. No. Simon says no. In fact, that's using a physical definition of resource rather than an economic definition. We need to do economics. And that's what doesn't appear in the world model that I talked about last time. It's what doesn't appear in Paul Ehrlich's work. And of course, he's famous because he makes a bet with Paul Ehrlich and says, you pick 5 resources. I'll make you a bet. Pick 5 resources. You name it. Pick a time period, and we'll look and see what happens. I say the prices will go down. You say they'll go up. And I think there was a bet like $1,000 or something to be donated to charity. Paul Ehrlich and 4 other guys took Simon up on this. One of these people betting against Simon became Barack Obama's chief science advisor. Well, guess what? Paul Simon, not Paul Simon, somebody, Paul Simon began singing. Julian Simon won the bet because Paul Ehrlich had said, free money is too hard to resist. After he won the bet, he said, should we bet again? And Ehrlich said, the fate of the world is too serious to be gambling on. Okay, good. And of course, now he says he's too optimistic. But how does Simon account for what we've seen? And he puts it this way. This is kind of, I'm going to just call it Julian Simon's dynamic cycle. And this is how he accounts for what we see right here. Why do we see the population growth but the rising income? And this is kind of stylized. He makes it sort of he says, first of all, imagine this. Population growth occurs. And population growth, kind of like Malthus says, means that per capita income falls. More mouths to feed. Okay. Well, Malthus stops there. Paul Ehrlich stops there. But that's not the place to stop because we're economists. Population grows, therefore per capita income falls because there's more mouths to feed, but that means increased scarcity. Increased scarcity raises prices. In the world model, this thing that they developed at MIT to show how the whole world economy evolves, what do you think the role of prices was? They didn't have prices in it. I almost used bad language. They didn't have prices. Oh, really? What are those? I don't know. I'm a physicist. I'm a computer scientist. Never heard of it. Increased scarcity raises prices. And that raises the payoffs, raises the payoff to innovation. Great. There's a potential profit to be earned if you can solve this problem. And in fact, that means that innovation occurs. Innovation and entrepreneurship. Okay, I'll just put it down as one word. Innovation. I'll put it as 2. Innovation results. And the innovations mean that the technical improvements from innovation more than compensate for the increased scarcity. And that leaves us better off than we were before. Okay. That explains why that's going up. Okay? I mean, you can think of this. You can you can graph it in a couple different ways. Let me pretend I'm Wolfram and use chalk. But the way his cycle kind of works, if this is output, well, let's have it be output per person, and there's time. What this would be telling us is that maybe you get some of these things here where you have falling per capita income, but then it's going to grow and it's going to grow. So he's got a thing that kind of goes like this. And of course, it's kind of stylized. It isn't really the way that's not a business cycle theory. There's probably other kinds of scarcity. Anyway, the basic story is he's explained long-run growth right there. Okay? Or if we were doing this in terms of the way I'd drawn that before with Malthus's model, where we had F of L, and then we have technological improvement to F1 of L to F2 of L. We keep getting more and more technological improvement. We can do more and more and more with a fixed amount of resources. That's what he means by resources not being as scarce. You can do more with them. Okay? You get more output per unit of stuff. Okay. Great. All right, well, that accounts for what's going on right here. But how do we explain this population change? So I want to do that, and then we'll move on. So questions so far before I proceed? Right. Well, again, excuse me, because Malthus has raised all these issues, it's important, I think, for us to, we're not going to come back to some of this, so we should kind of close it off, talk about population. We will come back to this growth and this innovation story, though. We'll see it next term when we talk about an economy where they fail to master the innovation, fail to solve the innovation problem, and see what happens. That's the Soviet Union, and it's a pretty interesting story. But if you're around next time, we'll cover that. But let's talk about population. We've got a population explosion. How do we explain this? Well, this is what seems to be happening, and this is called the demographic transition. And this is, again, pretty stylized, but it's relatively accurate. There's the birth rate, and there's the death rate. Okay, so BR is birth rate, and DR is death rate. So that's usually expressed in terms of per 100,000 population or whatever. How many per 1,000 or 100,000? We'll graph that on this axis, and we'll put time on this axis. Okay, moving into the future, past and upwards. And here's where we kind of start right there. And let's use red for death. Birth rate tendency over much of history is for birth rate to slightly exceed the death rate, which means that for most of history, you get very slow population growth, very slow population growth, as far as anyone can tell. And so that's going along there. There's the birth rate, and there's the death rate, and we've got a little bit of population growth. There's not too much difference. And we're going to call that, I'll call that 1. But we will call this, I guess we could call it the traditional economy. Or traditional society or something. Okay. And then what happens? That's the undeveloped world at any rate. And then at some point, something happens. I'll call this stage 2. And at some point, for some reason, death rate falls. And the birth rate keeps going. Now again, this is pretty stylized, but something like that. Great, what's happening here? Well, first of all, what do we want to call this? Modernization, industrialization, something. I don't really care what we call it. But just to give you an idea of what goes here. Okay? Modernization, industrialization, development of a more modern economy. Why does death rate fall? Historically, what happens is you've got better food, more food, better sanitation, better public health, and things like this that lead to a drop in the death rates. One of the most important things, if we look at Europe when this begins, is the development of clean water and sanitation. When you don't just dump sewage in the street, don't just dump garbage in the street and then drink water out of the same source. When they start fixing those problems, life expectancy increases and death rates drop, life expectancies increase. It's one of the most fundamental things. They've got to, no fooling. San Francisco is going backwards. It seems some people joke about this, but it's like you guys are going back to medieval times and earlier if you keep doing the things that are going on there. At any rate, great. You see the death rate fall for this reason. If you're talking about, say, less developed countries today, the pretty undeveloped world, one of the things that does this is modern medicine, vaccines and treatments that suddenly become widespread that lead to that. Of course, that, 1500, 1600, 1700 in Britain, their medical care was not extremely useful. It didn't do a lot. So it's other sources, but this happens. What does that mean for population? Plummeting death rate and a constant birth rate, population explosion. This is where the population explosion occurs, and you can see it happening right here, right? Population is exploding. And then what happens? We get into stage 3. And this is what's really interesting and what Paul Ehrlich doesn't seem to have. Now, as it turns out, this one will not go to 0. Godwin was wrong. At least so far, Godwin has been wrong. That's not, I don't want to. But this one drops. The birth rate drops. So we're going to just call that, I'll just say this is the modern, industrialized, high-income world. And in fact, exactly where it drops to, it could drop, let's draw it this way. It could go down to replacement, it could be a little bit above, it could be below. This is what we observe. And so what's going on here? Well, we do see this happening. What's interesting, if you look at data, you actually find that really the time when this kind of thing is occurring in the world is about the time that Paul Ehrlich is writing. Right around 1968, I think, is when, 68 or 69, that so far as anyone can estimate, the world hit a high point for population growth, and then it starts to plummet. Okay, so he couldn't have exactly seen that coming, perhaps. But what's going on? We see this plummet in the birth rate, and here, most of the developed world, it actually falls below the birth rate. Birth rate falls below the death rate. We don't even get population replacement. So that's why you see places like Italy, Germany, and places like this with a falling population, unless they get immigration. Great. For the US, it's right about there. What's going on with that? Can we explain that? Does anybody have an explanation for this?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, hypotheses, but, one of them would be, because more people probably enter the workforce, and you're going to have more, women are going to be participating in the workforce, you're going to be having less kids, there's going to be increased, education and stuff.
Are you trying to give me some sort of an economic argument? You should say yes. Yeah. This is an econ course. It's allowed. Okay, well, let me. Because I get into arguments with sociologists and anthropologists, not very often here, but I used to when I was elsewhere. Oh, yes, well, it's obviously this exogenous cultural change because there's something. Okay, I'm an economist. I don't think so. At least, let me give you the economist answer to this. What is going on right here? Because I think it's persuasive, and I'll say why I think it's persuasive. Why do birth rates fall? And this is an economic model that will help to explain this. And then we'll see how it is, how it stands up to analysis. Why do birth rates fall? And it's an economic model. We'll just call it the economic explanation. And here's the story. This comes from University of Chicago type people, type. Theodore Schultz and Gary Becker, Nobel Prize, famous economists, really good. But this is how they approach it. And they say, look, this is an economic question. Women have two alternatives. Women's alternatives are work outside the home for income, or stay inside or stay at home and raise children. Those are your alternatives, basic, fundamental ones. And they then develop an economic model of that. So let's put outside income on this axis. That's income earned outside the home. And then on this axis, we'll put the number of children they have. And what we're going to want to think about is not the birth rate, but rather the total fertility rate. That's what's crucial. So I better define total fertility rate. Total fertility rate is the TFR, and that's simply the number of children the average woman has in her lifetime. Woman, something. And that'll tell you, well, what is the average, how many children does the average woman have? Great. Well, let's go ahead now. We're going to draw the average woman's indifference curves in here. I don't even have to draw curves to analyze this, just things I can observe, like prices and things. And so we'll just call this the average woman's preference map. Great. And so I'm going to start out and draw a budget constraint right here. There's the 1800 budget constraint. And so the average, and this will be for the US. We'll make this for the US. Okay. In the average one's budget constraint, she could do nothing but work outside the home and earn that much income, have as, the maximum children she could have if she did absolutely no work outside the home is there, and then combinations thereof. Okay, so that's her budget constraint. Okay, great. Well, what did the average woman actually do in 1800? Was it a point like that? Anyone know approximately what that number was? The average number was 7. I think it was like 7.1 or something. So the average woman in 1800 would have 7 children over the course of her lifetime, okay? And then earn some income outside of the home, whatever that happened to be. Okay. Great. All right. Cool. But then what happens? Well, the future arrives. Time passes, something like this. Let me switch colors. And so the first thing is, different color. Increasing cost of a child. The increasing, I shall say, price of a child. The price of a child? Oh, how dare you. What do I mean by that? Well, how expensive is it to raise a child? What are the costs? Why does this change? Or what's changing? What's happening? Someone. What do I mean? Someone. Jack.
Educational expenses.
Educational expenses. It's a big one. If you remember the video that we just watched from the guy in India, he said something about educational expenses. Education is expensive, as all of you should know something about that. Hillsdale's not the cheapest college in the U.S. It's only the best.
Delivering a baby is really expensive these days in a hospital.
Okay. Healthcare. That's just a part of it, but I mean that's a part of healthcare. Okay. Healthcare expenses. What other thing? 1800 healthcare. What is it? Here, have a leech or something like that, or if that doesn't work, we'll just cut you with so you can bleed something. have here's some roots that we pounded into a potion. I don't know, whatever.
Rub dirt in it.
What's that?
Just rub dirt in it.
I usually, I just say go running, but all right, healthcare. What other things happen that are important here? Well, various kinds of material goods, material goods are more expensive, more space. Kids have their own rooms. Geez, children have cell phones. This is like people have lost their minds, but things like that. Okay, expensive raising a child has gone up. There's one more that's kind of important here also. What did the average person do in 1800 for a career? Farming. Farming, or maybe they had some sort of but farming. What do you do with your kids? Oh, go out and, feed the pigs or chickens or help bale hay or whatever they're doing. So, loss of income from a child. The child is just not able to help pay their own way. My parents were both MDs. I always said, Dad, can I come do surgery with you? Not today. Sometimes. Depends on whether we like the... No, you can't. I once got to take stitches out, but that was kind of cool. Enough about that. Oh, anyway, here, what does this do? This makes... That affects the relative price. That makes the budget constraint steeper, right? It must be swinging like this. That's what that does. That's what that effect is. So that right there in red causes that to become steeper. Child is more expensive relatively now. But then we continue with our analysis. What else happens is that women's opportunities outside the home increase. Women's opportunities, I'll just say they increase, they change, they get better. And what does that do? That means women can make a lot more if they work outside the home. I'll put it right there. Give myself lots of room to work here. That's a terrible marker. Oh well, it'll still show. And so I'm going to draw, that should then, this swings us in, but that gives us a parallel shift. And so it should be something like this. Okay. And people who are watching the video won't be able to see that, so I'll change it to green. Maybe that will help. I don't know. Great. And so there's our budget constraint for, well, we'll just say for 2000. I think I actually, well, for 2000 it doesn't matter. There's the contemporary one. 2020 is about the same story, okay? And where is the average woman now? At about 2. That is about 2 children, and making a heck of a lot more outside the home. Okay, the shift goes from there to there. Great. That's how they explain what has happened. Why do why do opportunities change outside of the home? And the first thing they point out to is the changing nature of work, technological advance. In 1800, work mostly consists of brute force and brute strength, and men have an advantage at that. And what is it in 2000? It's mostly brain power. A lot of it is brain power. And women have suddenly a comparative advantage at that. Okay? We have that. What other things might happen? Well, people point out, yeah, education. They weren't really educating women back then, and now, of course, women are a lot more education. And also perhaps changing, social and cultural change, social and political and cultural change. I'll just say social and political change, things like that. Okay, those things occur. I can tell you what someone like, I tend to agree, but what Gary Becker would say about those two, he says, those aren't really the things, those are just responding to this. Once the nature of work changes, it's too much of an opportunity cost to leave women uneducated. Back in the day when there wasn't really much that they could do with that education, it was different. But now that it's too expensive. It's an economic argument that they have. Okay? You can't leave them uneducated now that changing nature of work, that means that increases. And the social political change, that's just a response to those economic facts. That's a real Chicago kind of story. Okay? And that's the story they tell. Persuasive? I'm an economist, I'm persuaded. But what if you're not persuaded? What if you think, no, that's not right. This is because of cultural change, or change of ideas, or is there a way of addressing that? I think it's pretty persuasive for the United States. It seems to be what goes on. Can we apply that someplace else? Like, how about Chennai, India, the guy who was talking in the film? And he says, look, so India has a very different culture from us. It's Hindu. It's just a very different culture. And yet, what were they saying? With the upper classes and the middle classes, they were here and the lower classes were down here. Except that as the lower classes' incomes start rising, what happens? They start moving from here to here. Even though it's a different culture. Their budget constraints, their behavior changes in response to this. That's what that guy was saying. He was telling you right there. When he said, yeah, my grandfather had 7 children or whatever it was, and then my father had 5, and I only have 2, or whatever it was, whatever those numbers were. And he says, we put more emphasis on education for the kids now. You know where else that applies? Japan. Japan's way below replacement rate here. You know where else it applies? South Korea. These are all places with very different cultures, and yet the same thing seems to be happening. It starts sounding more persuasive to me. Now, it's always easy to tell a story that sounds good, and you say, this caused that. But how do you know it wasn't that caused this? Well, this is a way of at least testing those sorts of things. And just because it sounds good to me, and I'm ready to listen to a story about economics, maybe I need to also be careful that I just don't, because it sounds good, believe it. But this is a way of kind of getting at it. Well, it seems to be happening. We seem to be able to find it in different parts of we see it in Africa. It happens there as well. We see it on all kinds of different cultures. So maybe it's more than just this. I've argued with, not recently, but anthropologists and sociologists about what drives things. And I think the economics is a lot more persuasive. Is it the whole story? No, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of those kinds of things. Example, what state do you think has the highest total fertility rate? State in the U.S.? Guess.
Mississippi.
No.
Wyoming.
What?
Wyoming.
We're talking about human beings, not antelope.
New Jersey.
New Jersey.
Florida.
What? It'd be really interesting. I don't want to really get into this. It'd be interesting to know what you guys are thinking, but I'm probably better off not knowing. Okay, I was saying something about cultural factors and yeah. Oh well, Utah. It's Utah actually. I have to say, Wyoming. I don't know if you know this, but antelope, pronghorn antelope, always have twins. They don't have single. They don't have single babies, single fawns. And there are more antelope in Wyoming than people, by far. So you might be onto something. I don't know. At any rate, all right. Well, I'm afraid that at any rate, no. Utah has a higher total fertility rate, and it's because of the LDS. It's a religious factor. If you look at demographics, Catholic families tend to have more children than Jewish families in the United States or something like this, unless you go to the really ultra-Orthodox or something like that, and then it changes. So cultural things do have an effect, but this is the big, broad story of what's happened, I think. Okay? Great. Anyway, good. All right, questions about population? That's probably more than enough. well, hang on, was Malthus just wrong? Because he seems to have gotten that whole... There's an economist, I've heard him speak at AEA meetings. He's really good. I think he's really interesting. And his name's Oded Galor. He is, I think he's Israeli. But he was trying to develop what he calls the grand unifying theory of growth, a unifying theory of growth that will cover economic growth through all of human history from pre-human times, really, for as far as you can go. And what he does is he divides the world up divides history into different stages. And he calls up to here, that's the Malthusian stage. He says Malthus is exactly right about, his model is exactly right for that. And then what happens? And then we get that happening, and that then follows, okay? But Malthus is completely right about this until we get the growth here, and until we get that there. Those factors have to be tied in, and then we get a different set of things going on. And there it becomes a question of technological innovation, partly because of changes in institutions and market systems and things, and et cetera. And McCloskey, of course, would say, yeah, it's especially the bourgeois ethic and arguing about what institutions might be important. But that would be the modern period. All right, good. So Malthus is not so wrong after all. He didn't incorporate everything that needs to be done, though. All right, good. Questions? No? Okay. You're squinting. Is that question or?
I am.
Oh, post-calculus pain. That's what it was. All right. I don't know. I wasn't sure. I thought you looked like you were critical or something. All right, good. Well, there's Malthus. We'll return to him. That's Malthus on population. His theory is generally accepted by economists. The vast majority of people accept Malthus. And so let's move on, and we'll hit our next person, who is David Ricardo. And Ricardo, again, with all these people, they're my heroes, so Ricardo's another one. And he's really the one who, now we can say he's kind of the king, or develops classical economics. And 1772 to 1823. So again, he develops this Ricardian model, the Ricardian economics. It's retained in post-Keynesian economics and neo-Ricardian economics, to some extent in Marxism. And even you can find a lot of elements of this in modern neoclassical economics. And so Smith has given us the foundation. Bentham gave us utility theory. Malthus gives us population theory. Ricardo puts everything together and builds this whole general integrated theoretical approach. And when I say theoretical, Mark Blogg puts it this way. Ricardo invents economics as an engine of analysis. He has a theoretical approach. It's a way of thinking for Ricardo. For Smith, you could almost think it's a way of thinking, but it's really a set of a whole bunch of ideas and findings and things, doctrines. And this is not a body of results. This is a method for him. It's an engine of analysis. And all of the anti-theoretical schools hate Ricardo. So the German historical school hates him. American institutionalists hate him. They just think, this is terrible stuff. He's definitely has the idea of modeling in mind. Well, he's English. He's English, and his father was Portuguese. There's a big Portuguese. They were Jewish. They had emigrated they'd left Portugal because things were hard for the Jews there. They moved to Holland, and then from Holland they moved to England. And David Ricardo actually his father disowned him because he did something scandalous. He married a Christian woman and converted to Christianity. So, you guys find this, what? Go ahead.
Like, where was this?
England.
England? I thought the Church of England officially was Christian.
Yes, but his father's Jewish.
Oh, that's right.
His father's Jewish. That's what's like. He's left. the other section is saying, I say he did something scandalous, and they're going, is it scandalous? So I have to go. I did this in math econ today, and so I did that, and then everybody just looked. You guys know what that is? Some of you do. Thank heavens. Everybody has been astonished when I do this. You guys know how to write HTML code, like for a web page or something, or a little bit? Well, okay, suppose I wrote something like, I am smart, or something like that. And I want to emphasize that. Well, I can do this, B, when I'm writing the code, I put the brackets with the B, and it makes it bold. But then I have to turn it off, or the whole thing will be bold. So I go /B, right? And so that is not a real HTML thing, but what it means is I just turned off the sarcasm. So it means /sarc or sarcasm. So I said he did something scandalous. Just so you know, I mean, it is on film. I might get in trouble. It's not nearly as bad as the things I say in math econ in the morning. So, at any rate, well, Ricardo's history. So he marries this woman. His father is upset and tosses him out. I don't know if he tosses him out of the house. That's unlikely because at age 21, Ricardo was a member of the London Stock Exchange. By age 25, he was independently wealthy, so he didn't have to work anymore. Now you know what your next couple of years should be, right? And so he doesn't have to, he's independent, he's extremely wealthy. He begins studying math, he begins studying chemistry and geology just because he enjoys them. And he decides to go on vacation. At age 27, he goes on vacation, takes along a little bit of light reading, and he reads The Wealth of Nations. And that inspires him to become one of the greatest economists of the 19th century. And he becomes an economist, starts doing work in political economy, extremely famous in his lifetime. And afterwards, so some of his works, 1810, we will talk about, I won't talk about this one too much, but the high price of bullion. The high price of bullion, the full name is something like A Proof of Depreciation of Banknotes. It's a paper he writes about the study that he writes about the quantity theory of money and how when they detached banknotes from convertibility, the Bank of England, and just started printing them, that's why they get inflation. Okay, it's his quantity theory piece. When we talk about that, we're going to do it through Henry Thornton instead of Ricardo, because Thornton was even more sophisticated, but much more sophisticated than Ricardo. Similar arguments, they were on the same side, but Thornton is really the one we'll study. 1817, he publishes, we'll just call it his principles. We'll call it his principles on the principles of political economy and taxation. His principles of political economy and taxation, which could also almost be thought of as a textbook because it was used as a textbook. It may, for all I know, we tried to figure this out, haven't been able to. Might have been used as a textbook at Hillsdale College back in the 1800s. It would not be at all surprising. What else? This is the one I want to start with. 1815, he published his essay on the low price of corn. I'll just call it Essay on the Low Price of Corn. And corn, of course, means grain of all kinds. But the full title is Essay on the Influence of Low Price of Corn on the Profits of Stock. That's a report that he wrote for Parliament. And the backdrop is this, that they were writing about the corn laws and whether those things should be maintained. And we'll talk about that in a second. But he becomes very famous. He's well known as a political economist, as a writer, as a philanthropist. He funds 2 schools and an almshouse. He's elected to Parliament in 1819. He's highly respected. He was very reluctant to speak or to give his opinion unless he said, I want to talk about this. He'd be asked a question because I haven't studied it sufficiently. People would have to goad him into talking. When he spoke, he had a reputation for honesty and sincerity and for really knowing what he was talking about. So people took him very seriously. And I think he's a really interesting figure, admirable figure. But this piece, that we'll start with, deals with the Corn Law controversy. Corn Laws controversy. And what are the Corn Laws? Well, what's the whole controversy? Historical setting is this. In the 1700s, for the 100-year period of the 1700s, Britain and France had been at war for at least 79 of those 100 years. When I say that they're not friends, they're not friends. Some of the most serious ones are the French Revolutionary Wars, 1793 to 1802, and then that's followed, so it's moving into the 19th century. 1803 to 1815 are the Napoleonic Wars. And so this disrupts the European grain trade. There was a major grain trade, and particularly from Ukraine, Poland, Romania, and Russia, was where grain came into Western Europe, including into Britain. Well, that's disrupted. It's difficult to trade when everybody's fighting. And there are high domestic prices of grain. Grain, corn, and as they speak of it. Well, 1815 is when those wars are winding down, and the question is, should Britain return to free trade or freer trade in grain? So here's the question. The question, should Britain have free trade in grain? Or strengthen the Corn Laws? What are the Corn Laws? Well, the Corn Laws are a set of basically trade barriers. No, not basically. They're trade barriers, but they're price controls, price floors that work as a block to trade. And how it works is this. How they work is they set a threshold, PT, we'll just call that the threshold price. And if the price for the world market, price world is greater than or equal to PT, trade is allowed. Imports of grain, or you can have grain coming in if it's above that. If this, then imports of grain are allowed. And if the price of world price is less than, if it falls below there, trade is blocked. No imports. Imports are what are blocked. Okay, great. That is to say, it's going to guarantee that you will not have prices in Britain for grain that are below that price. That's the price floor. Okay, great. Well, the question is, Parliament is asking this question. Should we keep doing this? Does this have good effects or bad effects? What are the economics of this? Now, just as an aside, point out that I've read people who argue all kinds of dates for when the Corn Laws begin, anywhere from 1100 to some say 1815, which seems strange to me because the people would say 1815, but I think that's what Wikipedia says. 1815 is when they're debating this. Adam Smith writes about the Corn Laws. Adam Smith was dead by then, so I think that the Corn Laws existed before. And he traces them at least to the 1500s. So anyway, well, there's a whole debate over this and what Parliament should do. And instead of starting with Ricardo, let's start with Malthus. Because Malthus says we should strengthen the Corn Laws. He says that's a good idea. And here's Malthus' position. Strengthen, I don't know if he said really strengthen. He definitely wanted to retain the laws. So I'll at least put that down. Retain the Corn Laws. And what's his argument? Well, he says that agriculture produces a surplus over the expense of cultivation. It's like the kind of argument that the physiocrats make. So, land produces a surplus over expenses. And that surplus is the rents. The rents paid to the landlord that the landlord earns from having the land farmed. And this is from his inquiry into the nature and progress of rent. I'm not going to write it down. I don't care if you memorize the title, and I can give it to you if you want it. But So you can think of that as being the landlord's profit. Well, okay, great. The surplus, this surplus, that is the rents, create new long-run demand. That is, the landlords now have more income to spend. Great, they'll demand more goods, stimulating the economy, higher ability to pay. And he says, the most fertile land is scarce. Land differs in its fertility. And so, in order to expand cultivation, this makes it sound like expanding cultivation is a good idea. And he says to expand cultivation, we're going to need higher prices to do that. Higher grain prices needed. To expand cultivation. And his conclusion is higher prices for grain that come from the corn laws imply higher rents, more demand for labor, expanding economy, etc. Okay, higher wages. I'll just put it this way: higher wages, more demand for goods, and we can even just call it stimulus or something like that. It's not stimulus in the business cycle sense, but you get the point. Strengthen the corn laws, Malthus' conclusion. The corn laws are a good idea. Keep them in place. The opponents, Ricardo being one, in order to refute this argument, have to show that there's something wrong. They have to show that it's actually wasteful to have the corn laws, and that's what they're going to do. In the course of this debate, Ricardo and others developed the idea of diminishing marginal product, the theory of rent, theory of comparative advantage, and the theory of profit. Their theory of profit is not quite right, I think, and the labor theory of value, which is really not right. But they still do, there's some important advances being made here. We'll see. The first opponent, though, before I even mention Ricardo, before I get to Ricardo, I'll only mention this guy once, but he deserves it because he's apparently led the way. His name was Edwin West, and he wrote one of these reports for Parliament. So this is Malthus in 1815. Everybody's writing in 1815 for this parliamentary inquiry. And Edwin West, who's otherwise an obscure figure, he writes a piece called An Essay on the Application of Capital to Land with Observations Shewing the Impolicy of Any Great Restriction on the Import of Corn. It's a pretty long title for a pamphlet, but the pamphlet makes the following argument. He says, number one, in ag, and I'll use ag for agriculture. I can't remember if I've defined that before, but that's what I mean. In agriculture, we have, I'll just put it this way, diminishing marginal product. Every time I add another unit of input, it generates less output than the previous one did. He makes that argument. And then he says, not only that, that necessarily implies that the average is falling as well. Diminishing marginal product implies falling average product. Have you ever seen that before in this class? Well, as a matter of fact, you have when we did what we're calling the fishery model, and we had labor right there, and we had average product of labor right there, and we had the marginal product of labor right there, and that was it. He's the first one to lay that out carefully. And Ricardo follows almost immediately with this. Okay, great. So he's possibly the first one to show this, make this argument in economics. All right, well, what does Ricardo do here? So let's look at Ricardo's argument. And Ricardo's Ricardo asks this question. He says there are two important dimensions. A landlord is trying to make decisions about how to use his land. He's going to do farming. There are two dimensions over which he has to make a choice. He's going to be thinking about how much input or what land to use. And well, here are the dimensions. For the landlord, how much input to use? How much input to use on a given unit of land and the second question is which land to cultivate and which to lie fallow. Because you might not use it all. Those are the two questions. Okay? And Ricardo gives these things names. This one is the intensive margin. How intensively will I use a given piece of ground? That's the intensive margin. And this is the extensive margin. How far will my agricultural activity extend? The extensive margin. Have you heard these terms before? Intensive margin, extensive margin? We use a lot in economics today. Ricardo coins these terms. So for example, healthcare economics. What's the intensive margin for let's say for a hospital? Hospital has a bed. How fast do we get patient turnover in that? How intensively do we use this, in other words? Like one a day, one every 12 hours, one every 3 days, something like that. That's the intensive margin for a hospital. What's the extensive margin? How many beds should we have? How big do we expand? Okay, it's used in healthcare. It's used in other kinds of economics. I come across it a fair amount. Well, Ricardo uses it. He develops it in agriculture, and instead of drawing this graph, he lays it out in a table. Wes doesn't draw the graph either. But, so here's the way that Ricardo does this, and so. Here's the example, and we'll put right here 1 acre of land, and first unit of labor, second unit of labor, third unit of labor, second, third, first, and of course, the fourth unit of labor. We'll put that across there. And great, we've got that unit of land right here. And he says, suppose we add you don't get any output if you don't have any worker there, but we'll put a unit of labor on here. And suppose that gives us 10 units of output, 10 bushels of wheat. Okay, great. And great. If we put a second one on, our total would be 18 bushels of wheat. So what's the marginal product? 8, right. We just added 8. So I'm not going to write all the totals in. I can write total and marginal. You guys know how to do that. These are the marginal products that I'm writing in here. Marginal product, the first one gets 10. Add the second one, you get another 8, 6, 4. Okay, great. Okay. Who wants to be a farmer? You're the farmer. Okay, great. You didn't realize you're about to become the farmer? Well, you're the farmer. Oh yeah, awesome, right? Okay, all right, the price of wheat, this is what you're growing. This will be easy. Equals $1, okay? $1 a bushel, and that's how many bushels you got. And then the price of the wage rate is equal to $8. How many units of labor are you going to hire for your land? Would you hire one?
Yeah.
Yeah, why?
Because they make more than
It earns $10 and it costs you $8. Good. Would you hire a second one?
I could.
You could. It's a wash. Because he's using discrete terms there, it's just, if it were instead like this, where you can get just a little tiny little finite thing, that's the point at which they're equal, then you would definitely see that, yeah, we'll go until marginal cost equals marginal product, right? Okay, so yeah, we'll do that. Great, okay, well suppose what was he just doing? He was just deciding how much to use, how much labor input to use on the intensive margin. That's the intensive margin right there. How intensively will he use his land? Let's try the extensive margin. Let's say that there's 4 different kinds of, there are different qualities of land depending on their fertility. That's the type A land, grade A land, and then there's B, which is not quite as good, and C, which is even worse, and D, which is even, I mean, they're all fertile, they grow stuff, but they're in descending order from best to worst. And let's say the numbers for them go 9, 7, 5, 3, 8, 6, 4, 2, and what comes after 8, 7, 5, 3, 1. Let's draw some things in there so it kind of keeps separate. All right. Well, so far we know that you will use, they use green because he's a green thumb or something. Great. Given these prices and wages, what are you going to do on the rest of your land?
1 on B, and then maybe 1 on C.
1 on B and 1 on C. And what about D? Fallow. Leave it alone. Great. That's the land that's not productive enough to make it worth farming. Cool. Excellent. You're already far more profitable than the previous class was. And then he, it was an embarrassing experiment. He then hired well, we'll see. Let's see what happens. I don't want to tell you what happens. What happens then? Okay, cool. That was the extensive margin. It shows how far agriculture will extend in terms of land quality. So there's the extensive margin. And Ricardo has just shown how prices and costs influence the decisions on those margins. And there's the intensive margin going that way. Okay, increasing intensity. Increasing extensivity. We don't think of that, but. Great. Suppose now, instead, let's try this. The price of wheat changes. It goes up to $1.50 a bushel. Now what? How does that influence your decision?
That's a hard number.
Okay, what should I do? How about multiplying every one of those things by $1.50? Seem like a good idea? What?
3 on A.
Well, let's write some numbers down here. That's going to be 15, right? And that's going to be 12, and that's going to be 1.5 times that is 9, and 1.5 times that is 6, and so on, right? So that one becomes 1.5. That sounds like 13.5, right? And that one becomes, what's 13.5, 14, what do I do? Can't even remember what I'm doing. 10.5, there we go. Yeah, that's wonderful. 10.5, I'm afraid the caffeine is starting to wear off. 7.5, thank you. Great, we can stop. And then that one should be 12, that should be 9, that one should be 10.5, that one should be 7.5, and that one's 6. Now are you ready to tell me, how does your farming decision change?
3 on A, 2 on B, 2 on C, and 1 on B.
3 on A, 2 on B, and oops. Yeah. Great. Great. All right, good. So he's expanded on both the extensive margin and the intensive margin because of that change in price right there. The previous class, I mean, they actually seem like they're pretty smart, but They couldn't not only figure this out, but finally they appointed one of their members to be a financial advisor who counseled when the price of wheat goes up, reduce supply, stop farming. All right, I shouldn't have mocked them, but that was not right. That seemed right. I don't know. That's all right. As I said, I mock everyone mercilessly anyway. If I haven't done it to you yet, it's coming, I'm sure. Where were we? Oh, yeah. Great. Let's figure out look at this first case where we had, suppose that the price of wheat is 1. We know where that will take us. If the price of wheat is equal to 1, that had us here. What's the total earnings? Well, add all those up. That's 10 plus 18 plus 9 is 18, 27 plus 8, 35, right? Right. And how much does it cost? Times, how many were there? 1, 2, 3. So subtract, and what do you get? The difference? How much? 3. What? 3? No.
Yeah, 3.
What is it?
3.
Is it 3?
35, 32.
Oh, 35 minus 32. I was looking at it. And yeah, all right, that sounds about right. Great. What's that called? Rent. That's the rent. Okay? It's whatever's left over after you've paid your costs. Should mention, here's how Ricardo sees this. That's the unit of labor. 1 labor is actually equal to 1 unit of labor plus 1 unit of capital. And this is the men with shovels assumption, as Mark Blaug and others call it. So we had the mice in the barn, now we have the men with the shovels. So Ricardo wants to think about using land, labor, and capital, all of those things together. So he says, imagine that that's actually 1 unit of labor and 1 unit of capital used in a fixed proportion. And he imagines he's got a 2-input model. It's really just a 1 input where it's just labor and capital used in fixed proportion. But that way he can say, I've got labor, I've got capital, and I've got land all in one model. And so that's the payment to labor and capital that we had right there. And so what's left over? The rent. Okay? Great. That's his idea. Well, running short on time here. All right. Well, how does he get out of all this? If we expand, I'm not going to do it right now, but if you want to go ahead and look at under these new prices and calculate what the rent is, I think the rent comes to 12 if I did it right. And so the rents are going up just as Malthus promised. Except, here's the question. Costs are what are going up here for sure, and rents are going up, but the question is for Ricardo, why did the price of wheat go up? Is it because it's more valuable now for some reason, that's more in demand, it's more valued? Or is it simply because we have blocked trade, and as we know, blocking trade pushes prices higher, and as Adam Smith has warned us, that's as if we are importing bad weather and barren land. If all we were doing was increasing our production cost, then and when we could have been buying a cheaper alternative, then that's not a bad idea, not a good idea. All we're doing is raising costs, not creating wealth. Okay? So his argument and West's argument is corn laws are not a good idea. It's easy to see that we have rising cost of wheat in this example. Let's get this out of the way because of course, I'm telling this story in terms of inputs. So we had average product of labor, marginal product of labor, and if you look at this, these are linear. He does use linear examples. So there's average product of labor, there's marginal product of labor, and labor. What's an input? What about output? Well, output, marginal cost of wheat, here's the quantity of wheat that we're producing, would simply be equal to the wage rate divided by the marginal product of labor. Why? Because every time I add 1 more unit of labor, I have to pay the wage rate, and that gets spread over whatever the marginal product is. If the marginal product is 10 units of output, then I divide that, then they cost, you can see that, well, if it's 1 unit of output, obviously that cost me $8 or whatever the wage rate is. If it's 10 units, they each cost 80 cents. See? Falling marginal product, if that's getting smaller and smaller, then that's getting bigger and bigger. Falling marginal product means increasing marginal cost. That's his argument. Okay? And his conclusion is the Corn laws are not warranted. The idea that this is an economic benefit failed to take the higher cost into account. It's not a good idea to have the Corn laws. And then what's the result of this? Parliament is absolutely not convinced, and the tougher Corn laws pass. Malthus is actually eventually comes around and says, wait a minute, you're right, Ricardo. He converts Malthus to this position, but fails with Parliament. Well, that's interesting, I think. So, great. Okay, questions so far? Well, in doing this kind of work, he starts applying this more generally. And he develops, I will not do very much with this today, but we'll get this thing going. He develops what is called Ricardo's Corn model. And the Corn model is a model of the entire British economy. So we drew this, we call that the fishery model, it's a place where you go fishing. He's going to have this, only it's all of Britain. And the Corn model is a model of the entire British economy. And he treats it as if it's two sectors, two sectors, and those are ag and manufacturing. So agriculture and manufacturing, those are the two sectors. And for agriculture, it looks just like this. Average product of labor, marginal product of labor, the amount of labor that is used right there. And we have I'm going to put it way out here. There's the average product of labor, and there's the marginal product of labor. Wow, it looks just like the fishery model. I told you it would come back. Okay? And next thing we have to add is the subsistence wage rate. And so we'll draw that in. Okay. And wow, this is looking so familiar, isn't it? And guess what? Now we have to have one more thing, because here's where it's a little bit different from what we were doing before. We'll have to have a starting population. That's Britain's population at whatever point this starts. This is how he models the agricultural sector. Instead of drawing a graph, he just does it with numbers, with tables. And they really are linear, just like that. Okay? And then he begins working with this. And what do we have? 3 minutes? Do you guys want to stay around another half hour? Okay, well, you guys work it out. I'm leaving. Actually, I would stay here pretty late, I think. We could probably try to finish the entire course tonight if you guys want to just hang out. We done? I've got work. Well, it can't be that. All right, so we won't. Hang on a minute. Let me just say something. We'll come back and analyze this next time. But if that's my starting population, I can suddenly figure out what my total output is. I'm going to take my total product of labor will be equal to the amount of labor I have times the average that each one earns, right? Okay. And so here's my total product. And the question, remember, that Smith had raised was the long-run natural price is equal to the wages plus the rents plus the profits. But he never could figure out how it gets apportioned. Ricardo has an answer. I don't think his answer is right, but Ricardo has an answer to how we solve that problem. He's going to do it right here. We'll see it when he gets it. In fact, I'll show you really fast, because I do have 2 minutes max. Oh, don't worry, I'm not going over time. That's the total output, right? Well, there's the subsistence wage times, well, I bet the wage bill total wages, the wage bill, will be equal to W, the wage rate, times L naught. Okay, that's that box right there. I'll just call it wages. And, well, let's see. This is actually men with shovels. So that must be the marginal product is what each unit of the variable input, a man and a shovel, will earn. We'll come back. I'm saying this real fast, so if you miss something, you can watch the video, but we'll return to this. Great. So that's what the variable inputs, if that's the part going to the labor, that's the part going to capital. He calls that profit. And what's left over? What's left over? Rent. That's the rent. The rent for Ricardo is a residual. Now here, let's write. I'll just write down profit so you can see it. Profit is equal to marginal product of labor minus the wage rate times the amount of labor times, you know that, and the leftover is rent. It's a residual. And students so often get confused on what Ricardo means by that, what I means by that. It just means it's what's ever left over. It's what is ever left over after you paid those factors of production. And for Ricardo, that might not be a necessary payment. He says, yeah, landlords love to reap where they never sowed. And he says, I'm actually a landlord. I became rich and I bought a bunch of estates, but I'm not working on them. I just own them and I earn rent. So, at any rate, this is Ricardo, and he's going to use this to model the entire English economy, entire British economy. And it's actually sort of cool what he does with it, and we're going to see how the law of comparative advantage comes out of this. So, on that happy note, perhaps we should, I know I promised I would not go overtime, but there's a lot of glare on the clock, and I didn't realize we've gone a minute or two over, so I owe you a minute. All right. You get an extra minute on the final exam or something. All right. See you later.
Tuesday.